The Viking Age was a period in European history, particularly in Northern Europe and Scandinavian history, spanning from the late 8th century to the 11th century. The Norse Vikings explored Europe through its oceans and seas during trade and warfare. The Vikings also reached Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, and Anatolia. Additionally, there is evidence supporting the Vinland legend, which suggests that the Vikings reached North America, the far west of their explorations. The Viking Age began in earnest in England on June 8, 793, when the Vikings destroyed a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, which was a renowned center of learning across the continent. The Vikings killed the monks in the monastery, throwing them into the sea to drown or capturing them as slaves, along with the treasures they seized from the church. 6 years earlier, 3 Viking ships had been spotted in the Bay of Portland, but that event might have been a trade mission gone astray rather than a pirate raid. However, the situation at Lindisfarne was different. The destruction caused by the Vikings on the holy island of Northumbria shocked the royal courts of Europe and served as a warning. According to a scholar from Northumbria's Queen's University in York, such atrocities had never been seen before. The attack on Lindisfarne, more than any other event, cast a long shadow over how the Vikings were perceived for the next 12 centuries. It wasn't until the 1890s, during the late 19th century, that scholars outside the Scandinavian countries began reevaluating the Vikings' achievements, acknowledging their artistry, technical skills, and maritime expertise. Until the reign of Queen Victoria in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the Vikings were depicted as violent and bloodthirsty. In medieval English records, they were consistently portrayed as wolves among sheep. The first challenges to the many anti-Viking images began to emerge in the 17th century. Groundbreaking scholarly works on the Viking Age started reaching a small audience of readers in Britain. Archaeologists began uncovering evidence of the Viking presence in Britain, while language enthusiasts worked to trace the origins of Viking-era phrases and rural proverbs. New dictionaries of Old Norse enabled the Victorians to engage with the early Icelandic epic sagas, sparking a renewed interest in the stories and achievements of the Vikings. Thomas Bartholin and Ole Worm, 2 Danish scholars from the 17th century, along with Olaf Rudbeck in Sweden, were among the first to establish standards for using runic inscriptions and Icelandic sagas as historical sources. During the Enlightenment and the Northern Renaissance, historical knowledge in the Scandinavian countries became more rational and realistic, as reflected in the works of the Danish-Norwegian historian Ludvig Holberg and the Swedish historian Olof von Dalin. By the latter half of the 18th century, epic sagas were still considered important historical sources. However, the Viking Age was largely viewed as a brutal and uncivilized period in the history of the Nordic countries. Until recently, the Viking Age relied heavily on Icelandic sagas, Saxo Grammaticus's History of the Danes, the primary chronicle of the Rus, and the War of the Irish with the Foreigners. Only a small number of scholars today consider these texts entirely reliable. Modern historians instead rely on archaeology and numismatics, disciplines that have provided valuable insights for understanding this period's historical background. The Vikings who invaded Western and Eastern Europe were mostly pagans from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They also settled in the Faroe Islands, Ireland, Iceland, Scotland, Caithness, the Hebrides, and the Northern Isles, Greenland, and Canada. Their language, Old Norse, became the mother tongue of what is now known as the North Germanic languages. By 801, it appears that a strong central authority had been established in Jutland, and the Danes began to look beyond their own territories for land, trade, and plunder. In Norway, the mountainous terrain and fjords formed strong natural boundaries, keeping communities relatively independent from one another, unlike Denmark, which is characterized by lowlands. By the year 800, Norway was home to as many as 30 small kingdoms. The sea was the easiest means of communication between the Norwegian kingdoms and the outside world. In the 8th century, the Scandinavians began building warships and launching raids, marking the start of the Viking Age. The pirates of the North Sea were not only thieves, but also traders, settlers, and explorers. Scandinavian society relied on agriculture and trade with other peoples and placed a significant emphasis on the concept of honor, both in combat and in the criminal justice system. For example, it was considered unfair and dishonorable to attack an enemy who was already engaged in battle with another foe. It remains unclear what triggered the Scandinavian expansions and conquests. This era coincided with the medieval warm period, from 800 to 1300, and ended with the onset of the Little Ice Age, around 1250 to 1850. The beginning of the Viking Age, marked by the raid on Lindisfarne, also coincided with the Saxon Wars waged by Charlemagne, or the Christian Wars against the pagan Saxons. Historians Rudolf Simic and Bruno Dumézil propose a theory that Viking raids may have been a response to the spread of Christianity among pagan peoples. Professor Simic believes that it is no coincidence that the early Viking activity occurred during Charlemagne's reign. Due to the spread of Christianity in Scandinavia, a serious conflict divided Norway for nearly a century. Stay tuned for the next episode.